As a nonprofit conservation organization with a focus on birds, Audubon Arkansas's main concern about dicamba is the effects on the native plants that provide food and shelter for birds in the agricultural landscape. And to test my prediction that dicamba can have landscape scale effects on bird habitat, I initiated a community science monitoring project last year and this year, training volunteers to look for signs of dicamba on native plants on public lands across eastern Arkansas. And these are our results. These are the 363 locations where Audubon and volunteers found dicamba symptoms on native plants across 20 counties, showing that yes, indeed, dicamba's impact is across the landscape and on a wide variety of plants. And again, these are places where we saw damage on native plants. This is not the same thing as the misuse complaints submitted by Audubon. And I'll give you some examples here. So for example, this year I visited Chalk Bluff Natural Area in the very northeastern corner of the state. Northeast Arkansas, Boot Heel in Missouri, a hot zone for extend technology and dicamba use, and it's very easy to find off-target impacts on vegetation in the area. At this 55-acre preserve, I found leaf cupping on every tree, shrub, and vine there. Every oak, every elm, every redbud. This is pawpaw here, from the entrance way to the parking lot, to the trail that goes throughout this 55-acre state preserve, from the forest floor up to the tree canopy, all the plants showing leaf cupping and other symptoms consistent with dicamba. And just a mile south of this preserve, I found a soybean field that was cupping from end to end, which is a surefire sign of volatile dicamba in the atmosphere. Last year, a volunteer visited Delta Heritage Trail State Park and found multiple oaks with leaf cupping. I visited the same spot this year, and again, multiple oaks showing symptoms, some even worse. And it makes me wonder how many years in a row can a tree be hit like this and survive? Right across from this spot is a soybean field, and in that soybean field, I saw dicamba that had been recently sprayed. I also visited Parkin Archaeological State Park, walked the trail there, and again, multiple trees, shrubs, and vines showing leaf cupping and other symptoms. And I know dicamba was sprayed in this area this year because plant board inspectors collected tissue samples that tested positive for dicamba. So there's that green tree icon at Parkin, that's Parkin Archaeological State Park, and those red markers with the Ds, those are places where tissue samples that tested positive for dicamba were collected. And those places were turned in by farmers, not by Audubon. Also, we found damage on many churchyards and cemeteries across the region. 22 churches, 37 cemeteries, all having multiple plant species showing symptoms. These places tend to be small, they're surrounded by row crops, and I really feel they need to be protected from chemical trespass. You know, who's going to compensate these church communities or the cemetery managers when their trees die from repeated exposure to dicamba? This particular cemetery here is in Osceola, and last year a plant board inspector collected pigweed tissue samples in multiple locations that showed that dicamba was sprayed during the warm growing season. And again, these are inspector-initiated cases here. And nearby is the Kaiser Research Station, which, as you all know, was hit with dicamba last year and again this year. And Rower and Lon Man have also been hit with dicamba, despite the fact that they're supposed to be protected by a 1 mile buffer. I would argue that a 1 mile buffer or a 57-foot buffer for endangered species is insufficient to protect these places from volatility. Labels deal with drift. Volatility is the main issue here. And it's not even really about spraying within 1 mile of a sensitive area. It's not even about spraying legally or illegally. It's about the cumulative effects of spraying dicamba across the landscape during warm temperatures. So let's take a look. Let's zoom out to the landscape scale. There's the Kaiser Research Station, that green tree icon in the middle, Osceola's on the right, and then look at all these places where dicamba positive pigweed tissue samples were collected. And this is going to be an underrepresentation of the amount of dicamba spraying in that landscape, because of course, the number of tissue samples is dependent upon the number of complaints submitted, and the number of complaints depends upon the number of people who are willing, able, and knowledgeable enough to submit a complaint, and your inspector's abilities to proactively find and investigate these cases. And then remember that Dr. Norsworthy has told you that if every farmer who farms soybean and cotton in Mississippi County switched to Xtend technology and used dicamba, no other crop could survive in Mississippi County. And if it's true for the crops, imagine what it's doing then to the native plants in the fence rows and shelter belts. What is it doing to the natural areas? What is it doing to people's yards? So, speaking of people's yards, I have been looking into the case files, and this is one of a number of homeowner complaints submitted. This is one of a number of photos taken by an inspector showing that, yes, indeed, this person has all their trees and garden plants that show leaf cupping and other symptoms consistent with dicamba. And I would think that inspectors can tell the difference between dicamba and 2,4-D damage. So the inspector found, yes, indeed, this person's been hit with dicamba. He also looked at the surrounding agricultural fields, but couldn't find where that herbicide has come from. No pigweed dying, so no sign of drift across the road from the farm field to the yard. So what's the conclusion? No source found, no violation, that's it, case closed. Whoever sprayed illegally got away with it, and the homeowner has no recourse. There's no justice for them. There's no one they can turn to for compensation of loss of their plants. And this is one of at least 38 complaints so far submitted by homeowners and farmers that have turned out this way. No violation because of no source. And remember, when a farmer sees pigweed and decides to spray it, then days could go by before dicamba volatilizes. And then it could be up to 2 weeks before the plants in a person's yard start showing symptoms. And then it may be a few days more before the homeowner or farmer notices, and a few more days before they submit the complaint, and more days before the inspector comes out. And by that time, the pigweed has been sprayed, has burned away, there's no more evidence. And that's assuming that it even came from the adjacent fields and not from spraying some miles away. Just another example here, this is from a farmer complaint. One farmer submitted a complaint, but the inspector found there actually were 4 different farmers in this area, the 4 different colors outlined here, that all had cupping soybean. And despite all that cupping soybean and the inspector looking at all the surrounding fields, he couldn't find where the dicamba was coming from. No justice for all these farmers. And also, please keep in mind that dicamba is damaging not only row crops and native plants and ornamental plants, but also the very social fabric of our farming community. In this inspector report, a farmer submitted his complaint on June 18th that his soybean was cupping. And by the time the inspector arrived on June 24th, the farmer withdrew his complaint because he had received threats. And I know there have been threatening signs posted in the Delta. There's been vandalism of personal property over dicamba. And I really hope that people who make these threats are not rewarded by getting their way. And then also, I encourage you to look beyond the basic statistics of how many case files you have and how many case files result in violations or no violations. because not all results of no violation are equal. And in looking in the 2019 case files, I found that there were 31 case files that resulted in no violation, despite having found pigweed that tested positive for dicamba, despite having the smoking gun in a farm field that dicamba was sprayed illegally, no violation. And in 30 of those cases, it was simply due to inspector error in the reports. Incorrect GPS units or mislabeled maps or uncertainty over who the landowner was. And that resulted in many cases being dropped. And in one of these cases, one farmer had 7 different case files against him that were dismissed simply due to inspector errors. And why do I care about that? Well, because of the 11 case files in 2019 resulting from complaints submitted by Audubon, 7 of them have been dismissed due to inspector error. And only one, by the way, has resulted in a violation in the fine notice going out. Now, I know that I have submitted more complaints in 2020 than 2019. How many of those will result in violations is to be determined, but please also know that some of these complaints that I am submitting are on behalf of people who live and farm in the Delta, who don't want to turn in their neighbors, who don't want to be threatened because they're reporting dicamba. So they turn to Audubon to help them with this. And lastly, I want to remind you that the purpose of Arkansas's regulations on pesticides is to minimize the adverse impact on plants on adjacent lands, and by proxy, the birds, pollinators, and other wildlife that depend on those plants. Because dicamba's volatility can't be fully controlled and enforcement is so challenging, I would argue that there are no regulations that can make dicamba safe to use without off-target impacts besides banning over-the-top use. And I would really like to hear from weed scientists, from Dr. Norsworthy and his colleagues, before I believe that dicamba's volatility has been completely controlled and we're not going to have these off-target impacts. I mean, maybe the EPA in their new registration in weighing the risks and the benefits has decided that the risks are acceptable, but I encourage you to please do your own analysis. Please think about the impacts to all sectors of agriculture and the environment that you're charged with protecting. You know, how many more acres of cupping beans are acceptable? How much more damage to backyards, churchyards, cemeteries, and wildlife areas is acceptable? Are 200 complaints a year now simply the new norm? Are threats among farmers to be tolerated? Please believe me that I really appreciate and respect the challenging position you are in. I really understand that the regulations you've imposed so far are trying to strike a balance between both sides. I get that, but that does not mean that I'm not going to push you to try to do better. So I encourage you to please do better for everybody. And thank you very much for hearing me out. Appreciate you.